Hi, we've got a grid-tied solar array. There's 17 panels up on the roof and then another 15 on the pole mount in the garden area. And it's an Enphase array, which means that each panel has its own little microinverter, providing 240 volt AC power. And each microinverter sends signals to a central monitoring unit so that you can look at the power in each panel. And anyway, today I noticed that this particular panel here is not reporting at all. So either it's not producing power or it's producing power and just for some reason not reporting it. And it looks like it's been doing that for some time. On March 28th, about 3 weeks earlier, it was already not reporting. Whereas March 23rd, it was reporting a pretty much normal power. So fairly abrupt loss of signal for some reason. So again, could be just not reporting, or it could be a defective panel or an inverter. Unfortunately, the company that installed the system went out of business several years ago, and the company that made the panels went bankrupt. So we're pretty much on our own here, but fortunately the problem is in the pole mount and not up on the roof, so we can just go out, take a look, see what's going on. So here's the backyard array. Plenty of sun today. And here's the panel that's supposedly not working. There's the inverter. And it is blinking, which means it's supposedly working. So unfortunately, we've got some exposed wiring here, and got a clamp meter so we can check the DC side, see if it's producing any amperage. 1/10 of an amp. Oh, that's not right. Let's try one of the other panels. .4 amps. Let's try this one. 7.2 amps. So there's definitely a problem with that panel or the inverter. Now I could swap one of the DC lines from the other panels, but I think it's a pretty sure thing it's the inverter, so I'm just going to change it out and see if that fixes it. Of course, they don't make this inverter anymore, but got a used one on eBay, $80. It's the same model, M250, supposedly still functional. So that's what we're going to try. And got this tool for the cable. This was $20. So it's just after sunset, and we're going to turn off the power here. So all the inverters are now blinking red. I guess that means they're getting DC voltage, but presumably not producing any power. Let's see what the current is. Like 46 milliamps. That's a functional inverter. Let's try the broken one here. .38 milliamps, so not so much different really. But it doesn't seem to be producing any power, so let's replace it here. So the AC is disconnected anyway, so I'm going to try to take that apart first. There it goes. And we're still blinking red. So this part of the tool here tries to pinch these MC4 connectors. Get them to come apart. Try the other one. Well, there's one. Of course, we're not blinking anymore. And there's two. So here we are on the other side of the rail here, and that's the inverter. It's held on by two nuts, 7/16 wrench, although probably they're metric, 11 millimeter. And the bolts are in a little slot here, so they're not going to fall down into the rail. Okay, got the nut. And we're out. See if we can get the other inverter in. Okay, I've got it on the bolts. And it's difficult. There's hardly any clearance between the top of the bolt and the panel. Got it on the bolt, if I can just get it started. Okay, it's started. Okay, one washer on. And the lock washer's on. And the nut is started. Probably should have this further in this direction. I think that's better. Okay, I think that's tight enough for now. Okay, let's reconnect the DC. Only one way to connect it. There we go. That's one. Two. And it's not blinking. Well, it's getting dark anyway, so let's turn the power back on. See what happens in the morning. Well, I got the new inverter in, and it is blinking, so supposedly working. Let's check the amperage again. Oh, 26 milliamps. Kind of an overcast day, but it should be more than that. Let's try another panel. .1 amps. So that's more like it. So it looks like maybe the inverter was not the problem. We're going to have to check the panel here. So each panel has a junction box on it for the wiring, and rather than disconnect the panel, I'm going to go into the junction box because that's going to give us a little bit more information. It's a little tricky getting these open. They have little tabs on each side, and if you push in the tab, and at the same time pry down, comes off pretty easily, and then you can pry the other side. So this is actually the bad panel here that's not producing any power. And each of these junction boxes has 4 connections, and between each pair of connections is a string of photocells. So here to here is one string, here to here is a string, here to here is a string. So let's just take some measurements here, and this connection to this connection should be the voltage across the whole panel. Should be about 30 volts. And incidentally, if you have a string inverter, you can have hundreds of volts in a loop, so you might not want to try this. But here, since we have microinverters, the highest DC voltage is about 30 volts. So this terminal, the two outside terminals should be the voltage across the whole panel. And that's measuring 11.5 volts. Okay, so definitely something wrong there. It should be more like 30 volts. Let's look at the individual strings. So this should be a string. And that's measuring actually minus 0.23 of a volt. So that string is not producing any power at all, or even any voltage. So the middle string here, 11.9, which is actually a little higher than the whole panel. And the third string here, also 0.22 volts, and it's actually minus 0.22 volts. So actually a voltage drop across that string. So what I think this indicates here is we have a couple of broken strings. In other words, an open connection somewhere in this string of photocells. So what's happening is the middle string here is producing a voltage, and the current is going through a bypass diode. Each string has a bypass diode across it, so that if it's not producing, for example, if it was shaded, that current can go around that string, so you can still get power from the other strings in the panel. But we seem to have two strings with an open circuit, and not much you can do about that. Probably can't be repaired. I'll just have to replace this panel. Well, this panel next to it, even though it is working, has been producing somewhat less power than adjacent panels. So let's do some measurements on it. So 18.9 volts. Still much lower than it should be. Let's look at the individual strings. Minus 0.34. So that looks like a broken string as well. And incidentally, I know these panels are not shaded right now. So it's not just shading that's a problem, it's actually a problem with the panel. Okay, middle string here is 10 volts. And the third string, 9.2 volts. So this panel also seems to have one bad string, although it is producing probably at about 2/3 of the normal power. So just to illustrate, here we have a typical solar panel with 3 strings of photocells. So normally the current will flow through each string in series, producing something like 30 volts. So if you have one string blocked by shading, on that particular string. For example, in an extreme case, we have a leaf here completely covering one photocell. That means no current can flow through that cell, so no current can flow through this whole string. So in order that the panel can produce some power, we have these bypass diodes. So that allows current to flow through the string, through the bypass diode, and through the third string. So you get current flowing through the whole panel, but at a reduced voltage. And similarly, if you have a break somewhere in one of the strings, like I think we do have in some of our panels, same thing, no current can flow through this string, so instead it flows through this bypass diode. And there's a slight voltage drop across the diode, usually about 0.3 volts, and that will be opposite to the polarity of the voltage in the functional strings. So the microinverter will adjust the current to give maximum power from the panel. And turns out that's relatively independent of how many strings are functional. So in other words, if normally you're getting 6 amps at 30 volts, 10 volts in each string, if you have one string blocked, then you'll get about the same current, 6 amps at 20 volts. So the power will be roughly 2/3 of what it normally would be. And if you were to check the current, it would be about the same, even if one of these strings were blocked. So that's not a good test for an open circuit in one of your strings. Instead, you also have to measure the voltage of the whole panel. And you can also measure the voltage of the individual strings as we did. And sure enough, if we look at that panel that we just tested, we see that it is actually producing about 2/3 of normal power. So this is production on April 16th when I first discovered this non-reporting panel. And you see that most of the panels are reporting 600 and some watt hours over that day, whereas the panel we just tested is producing 416, so again about 2/3 of normal power. On the other hand, the microinverter was only designed to operate at voltages between 16 and 48 volts. So the panel that had 2 broken strings only putting out about 11 volts, that wasn't enough to activate the microinverter, so it was putting out 0 power and not even reporting to the monitoring system. And now notice that there are 2 other panels, this panel here and this panel down on the bottom, that are producing a similar amount of power, again about 2/3 of normal. So let's go take a look at this bottom panel here. And then the outside connections are the voltage across the whole panel. So let's measure that. And that's measuring basically 18 volts. So that's much lower than it should be. Should be about 30 volts. So let's look at the individual strings here. That one's 9 volts, so that's okay. And that's 9 volts. The third one here. And that's measuring minus 0.34 of a volt. So this string's got to be open here. and the minus 0.33 volts is just the current going through the bypass diode. So it seemed to have a bad panel here, and not much you can do about that. I don't think they can be repaired, so this will have to be replaced. Although it is producing power, just producing about 2/3 of its rated power. Now some people might be reluctant to do tests on the panel that's live in circuit and under load. And again, if you have a system with a central inverter and a bunch of panels in series, they can produce several hundred DC volts, so you probably don't want to be messing around with the DC circuits in that case. So you can test for a broken string on an isolated and disconnected panel. So here we have a panel, it's completely disconnected, and you want to do this in daylight, not necessarily in direct sun. It's an overcast day here, and I've got this meter. It's on the 10 amp setting, and we're looking at the short circuit current on this central string, which we know is good, and we're getting a current of just under 0.5 ampere here, which is pretty normal for overcast illumination. And now if we switch this to test the voltage, it's producing 11.3 volts, which is normal for a single string of a panel. And now if we switch to this outside string here, which from previous tests we know is bad, somewhat surprisingly we're getting exactly the same voltage, 11.3 volts. And that's because even though there's a bad connection in the string, it's sufficient to drive the meter. The meter only draws a few microamperes of current. But now, if we switch this back to measure the short circuit current, we see it's basically zero. And that's because even though there is a very weak connection in the string, it's not enough to produce enough current to register on the meter. The lowest you can measure here is 10 milliamps. So we know from this test that this is a broken string. Now it's frequently suggested that a quick test for a panel is to measure the open circuit voltage and the short circuit current of the full panel. But that can actually give you the wrong conclusion. For example, in this case, this string, even though it has a bad connection, is still producing an open circuit voltage of 11 volts. So if you were to measure the open circuit voltage of the full panel, you'd probably get a normal reading of 30-something volts. And similarly, if you were to check the short circuit current, the intact strings on the panel would produce a normal current of, say, in this case, 0.4 amps, and that current would go through the bypass diode in the broken string, and you might conclude that there was nothing wrong with the panel. So you really have to take the junction box apart and measure the short circuit current and the open circuit voltage of each individual string. Alternatively, you could test the voltage and current of the panel under load, but that's more difficult to do. Now I should mention that there's one other condition that can cause a panel to give out 2/3 power, and that's a short in one of the bypass diodes. Of course, in that case, it's bypassing one of the strings, not because the string is open, but because the diode is shorted. Now, I know already that The problem with this panel is not with the diodes, it's with the photocell string. But in any case, you can easily test for shorted diodes. And you want to do that with the panel completely dark, covered on one side, and the DC connections completely disconnected. So you just want to take the diode setting of the meter, and we're going to test each string which is in parallel with a bypass diode. Just test that with the diode tester. So in the forward direction, which is actually the positive on the negative terminal coming out of the panel, and the negative on the adjacent string, and we get 0.162 of a volt, which is a typical reading for a Schottky diode. And then if you reverse the connections, you get an open circuit. So that indicates a good bypass diode. And we can just go along here to the other strings. This is the good string, 0.175 in the forward direction. And open circuit in the opposite direction. Okay, so even though I know this is a bad string, we can show that it does have a good bypass diode. Now, if this had been a shorted bypass diode, what you would have seen is basically 0 volts in each direction on your diode setting. Now, in some panels, you can actually see the diodes, and if they're defective, you can replace them. On this particular panel, they're sealed in a box and inaccessible. And finally, I have heard of instances where 2/3 power came from a panel, and it was because there was just a bad solder connection in the junction box. But again, in this junction box, there are no accessible solder connections. Well, at least now we've defined the problem. 4 bad panels, 3 working at 2/3 power, and 1 producing no power at all. So the equivalent of 2 panels lost in a 15-panel array, that's a 13% power loss. Not easy to repair, so I could just live with it. In principle, I could put the 10-volt panel in series with one of the 20-volt panels and get the equivalent of one good 30-volt panel. Then it would only be an 11% power loss overall. At the other extreme, I could upgrade the whole array with newer, more efficient panels. Probably I'll do something, but I think I'll put that in a separate video. But meanwhile, some lessons learned. I should have tested the panel that wasn't producing, either directly or by swapping its DC lines into a different inverter, instead of just assuming the inverter was the problem. Still, there's no question that inverter failures are much more common than panel failures. In fact, a few years ago, I had 3 non-producing panels on the roof. I called a professional installer to go up and take a look, and turned out all 3 of them had failed inverters. Supposedly, the average failure rate of panels after 10 years is only 0.5%. In my case, it was 27%, so it must have been an especially bad batch of panels. Second, I should have been more careful in monitoring the system. I did notice that some of the panels were producing somewhat less power, but I thought it might be due to differential shading from trees, or maybe the power measurement just wasn't that accurate. At one point, I even checked the DC currents with the clamp meter and found they were all about the same for all panels, not realizing I should have checked the voltages as well. In fact, solar owners should be advised to specifically look out for panels producing 2/3 power, which could indicate an open photocell string, a shorted bypass diode, or a bad connection in the junction box. Looking back at my old data, I see that one panel was underproducing a year after it was installed. So at that time, I probably could have gotten the installer to replace it under warranty. Anyway, I hope you found my solar troubleshooting session useful. Thanks for watching.